Hey guys, it's Sam, and Skinamarink is the new horror movie that everyone is talking about. So, what exactly is it? Before we get into spoilers or theories or anything like that, Skinamarink is a horror movie that has already grossed over $2 million on a budget of, get this, 15 grand. $15,000. Experimental is the word that's being thrown around for this movie, but Kyle Edward Ball is the writer director, and he's followed in that grand tradition of Blair Witch and Paranormal Activity, and created the next huge lo-fi horror movie. The movie loosely follows two kids that wake up in the middle of the night to find that their father is gone and all the doors and windows in their house have disappeared. Sometimes it looks like it's shot by ghost hunters that have left cameras in the house. Other times, seemingly, it's in the first person. We never really figure out what is shooting this thing, but that's a moot point entirely. The point is not what is shooting it. The point is, what is this that we're watching? That's where we start to theorize. Regardless of the aesthetic, this is not intended to be a found footage movie the way Blair Witch or Paranormal Activity were. The reason that experimental is the word that's being used to describe this film is that there's not a traditional narrative per se to it. Time and space are kind of up to our interpretation. What we know is that 6-year-old Kaylee wakes up with her 4-year-old brother, Kevin. 4-year-old Kevin is a sleepwalker, and he's come home from the hospital after he took a fall sleepwalking that ended up with him getting stitches. He hit his head. Once they're awake, chaos absolutely ensues. We realize that the doors and windows are disappearing in front of our faces, but that's just the beginning. The toilets start to disappear. Strange stuff starts sticking to the walls. Dolls are upside down on the ceiling. The sound is purposefully muffled and at times really difficult to understand. So much so that they actually add subtitles to certain scenes of the movie. Dialogue is few and far between, and large chunks of this film are soundtracked by the audio of the cartoons that Kevin and Kaylee put on seemingly in the living room after they wake up. Look, there are two things that I really love about horror movies. One is that the genre allows you to try new outside-of-the-box things. And the other is that, almost by definition, the goal is to take the audience outside of their comfort zone. And on both of those notes, Skinamarink is super successful. The hard-to-define visuals, the complete lack of knowledge of where or when you are, the total unknowing will leave the audience at times completely distressed. No faces are shown, which again feels like something out of a real-life nightmare. The tense moments are really tense. The violence, or I guess the idea of violence, is super disturbing. But the moments in between those scenes are almost irrationally boring. I mean, there is nothing going on. And in small doses, that can be really good. That can help you build tension as you go. And at points in the movie, the leftover tension of what had just happened, as well as the fear of what's to come, had me cuddled up on the couch like this. But at other points, when so much time had passed, it led to a lot of watch checking. Like I said, I saw this at home. I was on the couch, which I think is the best way for me anyway to see this movie, because it leads to lots of being afraid of what's over your shoulder and who's in here with me. Seeing this in theaters, I feel like the creepy scenes would have creeped me out, but I probably would have gotten up to go to the bathroom 3 or 4 times just to stretch my legs to try to break up the nothingness that I was seeing. Ultimately, clearly, the movie leaves you with something to think about. If you're prone to nightmares or you're afraid of the dark or the unknown, this movie will probably burrow deep into your psyche. And even if you think you've left the theater unaffected, that night or a few days later, it'll start to creep in again. I mean, just look at this. If you're creeped out by this image, which I am, you're going to get creeped out by points in the movie. There's also this feeling of pure and utter helplessness on the part of the kids, which any of us that grew up with any kind of abandonment issues can relate to and will be immensely stressed out over. That said, at the same time, if you have something to do that's important right after the movie, or you're staying up late and you have to get up tomorrow morning, there will absolutely be points here where you're wondering, why couldn't they have just wrapped this up in a tight 25? I got things to do. This movie is like watching somebody's nightmare come to life. The only difference is that usually we only remember the really scary parts of our nightmares, the highlights. This is like watching somebody's entire sleep, which leads me to my theories about what is actually going on in this movie. Now, this is the point where if you want to take a break from this video and come back after you watch, feel free, because I'm going to get into kind of everything that was happening. So go watch the movie if you want. It's available streaming on Shudder. If you've already seen it, let's talk about this. Okay, I think the reason that this movie feels like a nightmare is because that's what it is. The reason so much of what's happening is implausible. The reason that we can't really make out anybody's face is because that's what happens in nightmares so often. We kind of get a familiarity with the scene. We know we're in our house, but we don't know why. We don't know how we got there, and we don't know where we're going. I think that's what we're seeing. And part of what we're seeing in the sense that we don't see the complete interior. We can't get a feel of what it's like to walk around that house. We don't know who any of these people are. We can't see their faces. Is because we end up putting ourselves in that nightmare. We've all been little kids. We all know what that little kid fear is. That, I think, is where this movie works. That we very quickly become 4-year-old Kevin. This becomes our nightmare. Because somewhere deep down in our brains, our 4-year-old nightmares are still there. Moreover, I think it's super important to remember that Kevin is a sleepwalker, because I think that specifically is the type of dream that we're seeing, a sleepwalking dream. That's why Kaylee is there. Kaylee at 6 years old is probably not able to process that Kevin is actually asleep this whole time. And I would imagine that in a sleepwalking dream, little pinches of reality keep finding their way in. So I think Kaylee is really there with him. But I think Kevin is sleepwalking through it. That's why at points we see Legos on the floor that have unexplainably been built and then been destroyed. Because when you deal with sleepwalkers, like people who sleep eat, you go into the kitchen and nobody remembers the fact that the whole kitchen was raided. Well, that's because somebody did it while they were sleepwalking. Nobody knows how all these Legos got built. That's because Kevin did it while he was sleepwalking. I also think the reality is that there is massive, massive trauma going on in that house. I think there is abuse going on in that house. I don't know what kind of abuse, but I think it's there, and I think it's pretty clear that that is a haunted house, whether there's a ghost in it or not. At one point, Kevin says, "I don't want to talk about mom." It feels like mom and dad are separating. At points, I feel like, oh, maybe mom has gone away and dad is the one that they trust. At other points, I feel like maybe dad is the one that's abusing them. Maybe the trauma just exists between mom and dad fighting with each other all the time, and it's just that has such a deep effect on little kids. I don't know, but I feel like specifically to Kevin, something very bad has been done. And that's where all this violence comes from. That's where all the dark imagery comes from. And that's where these feelings of helplessness and the inability to explain what's going on. Because how could a kid Kevin's age justify abuse happening to him? I mean, who knows? Maybe the nightmare is the father leaving. Maybe that's what Kevin is worried about because all this fighting is happening. And that's why he's looking for his dad specifically. Either way, I don't think, my interpretation anyway, that the violence that's happening in the movie is real. I think that that's trauma that Kevin is working throughout his dream. What I kind of worry about with Kevin is what we hear at the beginning of the movie. It's the fall that Kevin took, where he came back home with stitches and his dad says something to the effect that he just hit his head. I'm worried that Kevin was concussed when he hit his head, and that what we're seeing is not just a sleepwalking dream, but possibly a concussed sleepwalking dream. You know, this is 1995, right? So odds are that the culture of throw a little dirt on it, walk it off, no big deal, was more prevalent then than it is now. It's still happening now, but I think it was more prevalent back then, especially with head injuries. The Skinamarink, or whatever you want to call it, the demon that's in there with him, the other presence, it could be simply Kevin's trauma that's following him around. But it also could be death. They say the worst thing you can do when you get a concussion is to fall asleep. What if we're witnessing not just a nightmare, but Kevin's last nightmare? It makes those last words of the movie, when we hear the voice saying, "Go to sleep, go to sleep," so much more haunting if we realize that Kevin's concussed and may not wake up. I don't know. I don't know. All I know is that some bad stuff went down in that house, and it's given poor Kevin some pretty serious nightmares. And anyone that grew up with trauma, or anyone that is prone to nightmares, is going to be able to relate to this movie. I think that that's why it's sunk in so deep with so many people. I'm reaching here on some of this stuff because the movie provides absolutely no answers. All it does is give us stuff to interpret in different ways. Did it make me think? Obviously, yes. I'm here talking to you about it, giving me goosebumps with my theories. I'm thinking about it even more now as I talk through it with you. But would I recommend it to you or to somebody like you? I probably would not recommend it. I would recommend it to somebody who I wanted to talk with. I would recommend it to somebody that I wanted to have this conversation with. What did you think was going on? And maybe I would watch again for those details, but it would be a long haul to watch it again. To the average movie or horror movie viewer, no. I'd probably be pretty careful about who I recommended this to. Because as slow as this movie is, it will leave, I think, a lot of people questioning if the juice was worth the squeeze. That said, I am really glad that this movie exists. I am really glad that this writer-director did this, and I hope that it inspires people to make movies like this. We are in a horror renaissance, and I couldn't be more happy about it. Let me know what you thought about this movie. Put something in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We'll be posting more movie reviews as they come in. And I appreciate you checking this out. I will see you next time, unless a Skinamarink disappears all my doors and windows.
In this house.